There has been a lot of criticism regarding the talking point, 97% of scientists agree that climate change is real. We will soon see, however, that although that particular statement is false, the not terribly dissimilar statement that there is an overwhelming consensus of climate and climate change related scientists who accept anthropogenic climate change is completely and indisputably true. Let's hear from the opposition first, though.
Consensus. 97% of scientists agree on climate change. Before we get to the fact that this is patently untrue, it's important to note that science isn't determined by consensus, it's determined by truth. There might have been consensus that the Earth was flat among certain circles. Truth revealed that it wasn't.
Oops.
Crowder's statement that consensus doesn't determine science doesn't make any sense. What he probably meant to say was that factual reality isn't determined by consensus, and that statement would be true. Reality is discovered by a convergence of evidence, which in most science fields, the consensus of the practicing professionals of those fields reflect. Also, truth didn't reveal the Earth wasn't flat. Evidence did, and much of that evidence was known as far back as the Greeks. This comparison is extremely flawed, though, because there was nothing resembling the large-scale, collaborative, and extremely structured scientific endeavor as it exists today until well past the first scientific societies were founded, such as the British Royal Society in 1660 and the French Academy of Sciences in 1666. Taking thousands of years of untested speculation that people accepted based on superstition or expediency, and comparing this to the modern system of scientific endeavor is only meant to strike doubt on good science that is inconvenient. We also did not even know how blood circulated and the heart's role in the process until William Harvey explained it to us around 1628. But how often do we humor the idea that we might be wrong about that, just because we were wrong about it for so long the first time around? We don't humor us being wrong on blood circulation because we recognize that the generations of believing the wrong thing on tradition isn't as valid in epistemology as empirical verification.
Right away, the biggest argument used has gotten us away from actual science. But even this argument is false. The 97% statistic first appeared in 2009 in a study by University of Illinois master's student Kendall Zimmerman and her advisor Peter Doran. It was a 2-question survey, and only 5% of people who answered, a little more than 150, were actual climate scientists.
They were, however, all at least Earth scientists. Of those Earth scientists, 90% agree that global temperatures have risen since 1800, and 82% agree that human activity has been a significant factor in this change.
The 97% comes from an even smaller subset of people, 79 people who are self-professed climate scientists, with over 50% of their research being conducted on the subject of climate change. So that 97% first came from 70-something scientists who agreed that the Earth's temperatures have risen since the 1800s and that humans are likely a contributing factor. People used this number and ran with it.
A 3,000-plus person survey of Earth scientists, which shows a direct correlation of acceptance of climate change and level of specialty in climate change, is nothing to dismiss. Of course, you want the largest sample size possible ultimately, but to see this scientific survey of an indisputable trend and ignore it is absolutely dishonest. The funny part is that Doran and Zimmerman clearly conducted a good survey, because the multiple studies I will soon show you that were done afterward, but which Crowder conveniently ignores, all showed the exact same trend. That is called a convergence of evidence.
Meeting is adjourned.
When evidence was wearing a little thin and people started questioning it, in 2013, Australian blogger John Cook and his buddies reviewed some abstracts of peer-reviewed papers published from 91 to 2011. And what were his findings? Coincidentally, that exactly 97% of scientists, either explicitly or implicitly, made the assertion that humans were somewhat responsible for warming. Not even climate change, warming. His work was debunked as crap.
Back off, man. I'm a scientist.
In the publication Science and Education in 2013, for example, David R. Legates, Legate? I don't know, I'm not racist, a professor of geography at the University of Delaware and former director of its Center for Climatic Research, and 3 co-authors reviewed the same papers as Mr. Cook and found only 41 papers, a whopping 0.3% of all 11,944 abstracts, or 1% of the 4,014 even expressing an opinion. Certainly not 97%.
Strangely, but not surprisingly, Crowder leaves out a colossally important part of the Cook paper. That Cook didn't just leave it to his own interpretation to decide whether a paper supported climate change or not. There was a second phase where Cook asked the scientists whose papers he reviewed to rate their own studies about whether they support the consensus position. And of those scientists, 97.2% said their studies supported the consensus position. Crowder, of course, left mention of this second phase out because he intended to make it look like Cook was just misinterpreting the conclusion of the papers, with mention of David Legates coming to a different count. Crowder and Legates both also try to present the situation as if Cook was being dishonest, as if he didn't say in the original paper how many studies he and his colleagues reviewed were neutral. In fact, he did. Thus, Legates debunked nothing in his critique. His emphasis on the amount of neutral papers to climate change was based on what was already transparently mentioned in the original Cook paper. But let us talk about these neutral papers, though, since that seems to be what Crowder and Legates want to focus on. In the original Cook paper, it said that 66.4% of abstracts expressed no position on anthropogenic global warming, 32.6% endorsed it, 0.7% rejected it, and 0.3% were uncertain about the cause of global warming. There's very literally absolutely nothing surprising about 66% of the climate papers up to 2013 expressing much less new information, positive or negative, on climate change. Why is this, you might ask? Because by the 90s, most of the important factors working on climate change had already been identified and taken into account. This is evidenced by the Peterson, Connolly, and Fleck 2008 paper I cited in a different video showing that from 1965 to 1979, the vast majority of papers about global climate change predicted warming, 44, with fewer being neutral, 20, and still much fewer predicting cooling, 7. Climate science for the last couple decades has been researching disproportionately the minutiae, small factors that are not expected to have much effect on modern climate change, but are being researched just in case. Irrespective of the number of recent studies with neutral findings, the old studies still have not been overturned by the new research, and the glaring ratio of new studies that support human-driven climate change through global warming relative to the amount that reject it most emphatically does not support the denialist position, but it does unequivocally support what the consensus claims. An extremely important thing to mention is that Crowder has, at this point, done a bait and switch. Cook's paper wasn't about polling scientists on what they thought about climate change. It was a look directly at the evidence itself to see where it pointed, and asking scientists who wrote those papers to make sure he hadn't misinterpreted what was in the evidence, what was in the papers. Thus, Cook's paper was no appeal to authority, but an appeal to the evidence itself.